Hello, everyone. We will be getting started just after 1 o'clock, so sit tight. Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. So I want to welcome everyone and thank you for joining us. We have a wonderful speaker today and a very important and enlightening topic for our webinar. So we will start in just a minute after I go over a couple of items. There is a slide presentation that everyone should be able to see. The welcome slide is now on the screen. If you are having any problems seeing this, please go to UCNet where you can find the link to the webinar. If you put in the keyword Bruce link, it will show you the article where you can find the link to this. We are also recording the webinar, so all lines have been muted, but we do want to hear from you. So please use the Zoom chat feature to submit any questions you may have. All questions will be answered after the presentation, though if you need any clarification, please type it in and we will address it as we can. If you hover your mouse over the bottom of the Zoom window, a toolbar will appear and there is a chat bubble, and that is how you will submit to everything. By the end of this week, a complete recording of this webinar, both audio and visual, will be available on the Stigma-Free UC page on UCNet. And with that, I would like to explain a little bit about how this webinar fits into the bigger picture. Stigma-Free UC is part of system-wide well-being, which sponsors and promotes events, programs, and resources that impact and improve UC employees' emotional, financial, physical, and nutritional well-being. This webinar was created in partnership with Dr. Bruce Link. The Stigma-Free UC initiative, which supports UC employees' emotional well-being, has been developed to foster an open, positive discussion about mental health. Through monthly programming, sharing the vast knowledge of UC experts, this one-year awareness project is focused on the elimination of mental illness discrimination through educational webinars, discussions, videos, and more. Because statistics show that those who learn about mind disorders show more compassion towards those with a disorder, throughout our program, we'll continue to emphasize that mental illness is simply a part of the human condition. I would now like to introduce Dr. Bruce Link, Distinguished Professor of Sociology and Public Policy at UC Riverside.
Great, thank you all for being on the line. And I'm happy to be able to talk to you a while about some things that I've been interested in for a very long time. I started my work on stigma around mental illness in the 1970s, maybe before some of you were alive. And I've continued it up until the current time. And I'll be telling you some of what I think I've learned about this important topic. My screen, you'll see me looking up, and the reason I'm looking to the left a little bit is that I'm looking at my slides, and so I'll look a little strange, but I decided to keep me on just to keep it as personal as possible. Anyway, why don't we get started? I'm at the University of California, Riverside now. I'm in public policy and in sociology appointed. I also have affiliation with the medical school here, our excellent new medical school here, and the Center for Healthy Communities there and other groups there. So that's a little bit about me, and why don't we get started? We can go to the next slide. I'll be saying next all the time when I finish a slide because I can't advance them myself. So these are the things I want to cover today. I want to cover some thinking about what is stigma. I want to talk about stigma as minority stress. I want to ask the question, how does stigma affect the stigmatized? Then I want to talk about, can we think of stigma as a social determinant of health? And what can be done to address mental illness stigma? So something different in today's talk will be that I'll be emphasizing stigma as a potential of many kinds of circumstances as being a possible cause of mental health problems. A lot of times we think about people with mental health problems being exposed to stigma, but if you're stigmatized in other domains of life or in terms of having a mental illness, it can also be a cause of mental health problems, and I'll be emphasizing that. Okay, next, please. So what is stigma? Next. If we go back in time, of course, we'll go back to Erving Goffman. You've probably heard this in other talks about this topic. But Goffman, and you see a picture of him, famously describes stigma as an attribute that's deeply discrediting and reduces the bearer from a whole and usual person to a tainted and discounted one. Another definition given by someone who is one of my heroes, a guy named Amerigo Farina there, in a book with Jones and others, a mark that sets a person apart and links the marked person to undesirable characteristics. Now, just for a minute, look at those definitions and think about them, and think about whether there would be something about them that might bother you if you were a person on the stigmatized side of the stigma phenomena. And it turns out that there was critiques of those kinds of definitions. And the things that they pointed to is the use of terms like attribute and mark as being things that people possessed. Next slide, please. So I just mentioned that stigma as being an attribute, something that the stigmatized person has rather than something that's conferred on them or selected from amongst many things for social salience. That was one criticism. Another criticism was that stigma research had tended to focus on the process of categorization, how we make categories, and the linking of the categorization to stereotypes, and less on the broad discrimination and social exclusion that some people face because of stigma. Next, please. So we used those critiques as a lever to try to rethink for ourselves, myself and Joe Phelan, they're the authors of this particular paper, to rethink stigma. And we decided to think about it as an umbrella concept, and that stigma adhered in the convergence of multiple components. We thought that is what might best characterize stigma. And so we identified 6 components, and I'll be going through them in more detail in just a second. But just to list them off for you, that people distinguish and label human differences. So we're using the word label there rather than attribute. So it's something that's conferred. So we're responding to that criticism. And then labeled persons are linked to undesirable characteristics, to unwarranted negative stereotypes. And third, that labeled persons are viewed as an outgroup, as a them, not us. That their emotions, both for the stigmatized person and for the person who does the stigmatizing, involved in the stigma process. 5, labeled persons experience a status loss and discrimination. And finally, something that we kind of made this paper is that we saw stigma as dependent on social power. Next, please. So I'll be going through each one of those components. So first is the distinguishing and labeling of human differences. Now, if we think about all the people on this call, all the ways we're different, you know, from our genes to how long our toenails are to whether we have hairy ears or not, we have a huge number of human differences. But some human differences are plucked out for social salience and become very important. So our sexual preferences, the color of our skin, and things like that are very prominent, whereas things like hairy ears or other attributes that of us, you know, our toenail length or whatever, are not brought out for social salience. And some of the things that, so there's this social selection of attributes for salience or significance, and this is part of the labeling process. Now, sometimes this seems so obvious to us that it seems taken for granted, like having one leg instead of two. Of course, we see that, and it's prominent for us. But if we think about it, the person who has one leg rather than two is different in all sorts of ways. But for social salience, we overemphasize that attribute about that person and bring it to social salience. We can't look at that person without thinking of anything but that, and that is kind of part of this process. So next slide, please. Next. Okay. Then the second part is linking the labeled person to negative stereotypes. So if I know you are a blank that I've labeled you, then I think you are also blank. That's the stereotype. So a person with mental illness, that you're dangerous. Person with psoriasis, dirty, Roma gypsy, slyly criminal, young black male, violent, live in a trailer, bigoted and slow-witted. These horrible stereotypes are connected to the labeling when stigma is active. Next. And there's a separation of us and them, so that stigmatized group belong to a separate category. They're sort of different. We have separate words for them, and they're a they, and they're different from us. And when it's really extreme, it's fundamental. And in the extreme, the designated person are no longer really human. We've seen that with the horror of the how the Nazis exterminated the Jews, and so on. So this us versus them is prominent in stigma. Next. And then there are emotional reactions connected to stigmatization. So not always, but sometimes people feel shame, humiliation, or embarrassment around being stigmatized. And sometimes people who are on the stigmatizing side feel disgust, fear, or anger. So emotional reactions are also part of what comes with stigma. Next. And here we're responding to the part of the critique of the early stigma that it hadn't been carried through enough to the dynamics of putting people down and excluding them and discriminating against them. So we said that if stigma exists, it's got to include this as well. Stigma involves status loss, that's a downward placement in a social hierarchy, or a disenfranchisement as a valued person, someone of worth. And we might see that going on now as a struggle now with respect to undocumented people and immigrants and so on. And then finally, for stigma, when stigma is full and complete, there's discrimination in jobs, housing, schooling, friendships, intimate relations, and just general exclusion from key domains of social experience. Next. And then our observation that to carry this off, stigmatizers have to have power over the stigmatized. Someone has the power to decide which characteristics to make salient. Sometimes we take that very for granted, like one leg versus two, but it is some kind of power that this is what matters and this is what's brought forward in the social situation and not something else. And there's the power to construct the ambient stereotypes. Who gets to make those up? Who has the power to pull that off and make it broadly so that it's sort of inside us and then we only discover it from implicit tests and so on. So there's another component of power there. And the power to broadly accomplish the separation of us and them, to make that distinction and the theming part really strong. It takes power, so you have to have power to do that. And then finally, if there's going to be exclusion in jobs, housing, educational opportunities, you have to have the power to control those. You're the one who decides who gets the housing, who gets the job, who is selected into the educational opportunity. So power is very important to stigma. Next. So that's our trying to think through what the essence of stigma is across many stigmatizing circumstances. If you go to any one particular circumstance of stigma, you'll find it's very different. None of them are the same, really. Different stereotypes, different dynamics. It's always different. But the essence, if we're going to call something stigmatized, it should have those elements is what we think. And so let's go to the next slide. And here's a short list of things that are stigmatized. Mental illness, which might be our main topic for today, but drug addiction, sex work, psoriasis, irritable bowel syndrome, incarceration, obesity, developmentally disabled, being undocumented, being a race or ethnic minority, being a religion that's discriminated against, lesbian, gay, transgender, disabled, smoker, etc. And that's the short list. There's a long list of things that are stigmatized. So we're thinking that definition we gave is at least somewhat evident in each one of these circumstances. Okay, next. So how does stigma affect the stigmatized? Now, I'm going to be making the case here that stigma around a lot of different circumstances can influence and create mental health problems for the people who are being stigmatized. So let's go to the next. And I like to think about this from the vantage point of minority stress, Elon Meyer's concept. Next. So he says minority stress is something that is unique. It happens because you are a stigmatized minority. So for example, for myself, there's aspects of that I don't confront at all. Being a heterosexual person, I don't have to worry about something somebody might think of me because of me being gay. As a man, I don't have to worry about being raped. There's all sorts of things that I don't have to worry about that someone who's on the other side of a disadvantaged relationship might have to worry about. So it's unique to the stigmatized group, and it's an added-on thing. And it's chronic as opposed to acute kinds of stresses like if my mom died or I lost my job or I didn't get a paper in my favorite journal. Those would be acute things, but the minority stress that comes with stigma is just ongoing. It's kind of always there, it weighs on you. It can possibly weigh on you. And then it's socially based minority stress. Its origins are in social relationships. And to emphasize again, minority stress indicates that it is excess stress that one experiences because of one's minority status. It's added on to the normal stresses that we all experience. Next. This is a complicated slide that Meyer provides to indicate the minority stress process for gay and lesbian individuals. And I don't want to go through every box in this. You could look at it in the article. But the main point of it is in the center there, the idea that there are the general stressors, box C, but then these added on things of minority stress, the prejudicious events and discrimination, exposure to violence, and then the things that people have to worry about that people who aren't in the stigmatized status might not have to worry about, at least with respect to that particular characteristic, like expectations of being rejected, needing to conceal, or taking in the societal attitude and feeling it inside yourself, as in his example of internalized homophobia. Next slide. So the contributions of this concept in my thinking are that stigma, this is the first time in a really strong way, stigma is related to the stress paradigm. So that when stigma is occurring, it's connected to stress, and that therefore it has, you can think about it as having a cascade of influences that stress has, and it makes good sense in that way. And as I've said a couple times, it emphasizes the added burden associated with minority status. And then one other thing that often isn't thought about when you talk about minority stress is it helps explain why non-minorities may be clueless about the experience of minorities. So if you're not living this experience, you're not going to know what's going on. And when someone complains about it, you might think that they're excessive or something like this. They're too sensitive. And part of the problem there is it's just not part of the world of the person who's not on the minority side of the division. And they just haven't experienced it and they don't get it. Next slide. So how does stigma affect the stigmatized? I'm going to say just a little bit, and they're just examples about three generic mechanisms. So one is the one we usually think of, that stigma leads to direct person-to-person discrimination. So one person does something to another person because of an animus associated with stigma, and they discriminate or harm that person. A second is expectations, or things that I call working through the individual. You're worried about how you're going to be treated. You're vigilant that is it going to, if people know about my status, are they going to treat me differently? Are they treating me the way they're treating me because I have that status? Is that what's salient in this situation? This is kind of like always on your mind. And then finally, something we'll call structural stigma, which we'll spend some time defining in just a little bit. Okay, next slide. So with respect to person-to-person discrimination, there's tons of places we could go to find evidence about this. Pascoe and Richmond in a Psych Bulletin meta-analysis is one key citation. Next slide. And what they show is robust evidence for negative effects of person-to-person discrimination. They looked at a large number of studies, 192, raising from size from 30 to over 8,000. And they looked at a range of outcomes, but a main part of the outcomes were mental health, consistent with my theme that mental health problems can be the result of stigmatization around other circumstances. And so that experiences of direct person-to-person discrimination are consistently associated with mental and physical health problems is the conclusion of this meta-analysis. You'll have noted that was done in 2009. They've updated that in a recent book that we published called Stigma and Health to much more recent data with pretty much the same conclusion. Okay, next slide. So next, I want to just give one example, and there are many, many examples that could be given of this, of the effects of stigma operating through the individual, sort of a social psychological mechanism of harmful consequences. Next slide. And it's something that I worked on, and it's called modified labeling theory. And it was a theory that was designed to account for disadvantaged outcomes in the absence of blatant person-to-person discrimination. How could this process operate even when blatant person-to-person discrimination wasn't occurring, is the question asked. And it was asked around a mental illness designation. And the idea was, how this might work was that there are ambient beliefs about whether people will devalue and discriminate against people with mental illnesses, so that as we go through our socialization and our daily life, the idea is that we have an idea about how most other people might treat someone who had a serious mental illness. And would they want to date that person? Would they want to hire that person to be a babysitter for their children? Would they want that person to be a teacher in a school? Would they take the person this seriously? And we all kind of have ideas about how a person with mental illness might be treated by other people. It's sort of, we could ask ourselves the question, would most people discriminate against a person with mental illness? These are in our heads. And for someone, I like to put it in this way, thinking about Bruce Link 1 and Bruce Link 2. Bruce Link 1 grows up and never develops a mental illness. Bruce Link 1's got these ideas of whether most other people will discriminate against a person with mental illness, but it's not personally relevant to me. I haven't experienced it, a mental illness, and so those beliefs don't bear any impact on me. Bruce Link 2 grows up and develops a mental illness, gets hospitalized for that mental illness, so it's kind of strongly labeled by the connection. All of a sudden, those beliefs are personally relevant. So if most people are not going to want to date me, they're going to think less of me, then it could possibly apply to me because they might know if I've been in a psychiatric hospital. And as this could have consequences, even if they don't directly right away do anything to harm me. I might feel bad because I've gotten this status that I know most people are negative about, and it might make me depressed, fearful. I might even feel a little ashamed. So that can happen right away. And then I might cope by withdrawing from social interactions to protect myself from discrimination that I think might happen if I ventured out. I might not ask for the date. I might not have the confidence to ask for the job. And so I can be hurt through my efforts to protect myself from the possibility of being discriminated against. And then there are these beautiful social psych experiments that have shown how if you go into a situation and you have the anticipation that maybe you'll be viewed negatively, it erodes your confidence and you don't perform as well. So even if the other person doesn't know that you have that, if you think they do, it could make you a little less confident, you perform less well, you're less liked, you're less likely to be selected, and so on. So those are multiple ways in which there can be consequences. Next slide. So that happened a long time ago, that theory and the first articulation of it. These are some of the things it's been connected to over time. So it's not just, it's unemployment and income loss, smaller social networks, quality of life, feeling demoralized, not seeking help because you don't want to acquire the label, and a diminution in your self-esteem. Next. So that was an example of how it could work through a person. Now, the third meta mechanism I want to talk about is structural stigma. So what is that? Next slide. It's really something that was like I got taught by people I was supposed to be their mentors. I got taught by them. One of them was this Mark Hatzenbuehler, who's made it his central program of research to investigate structural stigma. And he and I worked on a special issue of Social Science and Medicine that was published in 2014 that was trying to bring forward the idea of structural stigma. Next. So these are the two domains of structural stigma we identified. So policies or laws that disadvantage a stigmatized group in marriage and housing, in jobs and parental rights and rights of citizenship and so on. So that would be sort of laws that are applied that control and constrain people who are in stigmatized groups. And then second is attitudinal climate scenarios that block people from access to places and make stigmatized people uncomfortable when they're in such places. So just a famous social psychologist call it a threat in the air, just the attitudinal climate that people pick up, and they know not to travel to that neighborhood, they know not to go the southern route or something like that. Those kinds of influences on people from sort of the ambient attitudes in a context. Those are the two components of structural discrimination we identified. Next one. And just to give you an example of this, I'll give you an example of one piece of his Mark Hatzenbuehler's research. Next slide. It's a quasi-experiment that tests the effect of structural stigma on sexual minorities. And he was accorded an interesting chance to test this in what you might call a natural or a quasi-experiment, maybe a quasi-experiment because its roots weren't exactly natural. Occurred in between two waves of a high-quality study of mental disorders, when some states enacted gay marriage bans where others did not. And so what Hatzenbuehler's study was able to do is examine the consequences for mood disorders among people who identified as gay or lesbian. Next one. So it was the high-quality study was the National Epidemiologic Survey on Alcohol and Drug and Related Conditions, the NESARC. It's really large. The initial wave was over 30,000, and all in all the states. So it allows you to find people in all the different states. It was of households and group residences. It was face-to-face. It had a pretty good response rate, and it collected information on DSM-4 diagnoses, and it also asked questions about self-identification as a sexual minority. So they asked about sexual orientation, in the survey. Next slide. And here, we have red state, blue state all the time. This time, it's red states that passed constitutional amendments banning gay marriage, and blue states not passing the constitutional amendments. And then this was between the first administration of this large survey in 2001 and the second one in 2004. Okay, next. So this slide is showing you lesbian, gay, and bisexual adults living in states that ban same-sex marriage and that they experience an increase in mood disorders. So this is just about the lesbian, gay, and bisexual people in this huge survey. You see on the left-hand side is those who were in states that between 2001 and 2005 instituted a ban. And on the right-hand side are people who are lesbian, gay, or bisexual who lived in states that didn't institute a ban. And what you see in the left-hand side there is there was, from the lighter blue to the purple bar, from the first wave to the second wave of data collection, with the ban occurring in between, there was an increase in the mood disorders in the states where, for individuals living in states where a ban was implemented. On the right-hand side, you see there was actually a little decrease in mood disorders. These were statistically significant. And you can see the odds ratios there for those of you who are interested in those at the bottom. Next slide. And this slide shows the same two bars for the lesbian, gays, and bisexuals living in the states where there was a ban on the left-hand side, and then heterosexuals on the right-hand side. So what this shows is that the increase for the lesbian, gays, and bisexuals in the states where there was a ban is something that happened just to their group. It didn't happen to heterosexuals. So it wasn't something about these states traveling through time. It just happened to produce more mood disorders in those states. Rather, it was only for the lesbian, gay, and bisexual group. So that is Hatzenbuehler's way of trying to specify the causal influence here. It only occurred to the people who might be disadvantaged by it. Next slide. So just to summarize so far, stigma is a multifaceted social process that applies to many circumstances. There's evidence that stigma has harmful consequences for health through many mechanisms operating at multiple levels. So not just person-to-person discrimination, but also these subtle social psychological processes operating through the individual and also at structural levels. And so stigma creates mental health problems and likely contributes to their persistence. Next. So now I want to think with you a little bit about how important is stigma as a social determinant of health. Next. So if you go to places that might reflect, what are the most important social determinants of health, one place you might go to is to medical sociology. And here's the Handbook of Medical Sociology. Great book. It covers a lot of social determinants, socioeconomic position, social relationships, medicalization, things like that. But there's no chapter on stigma as a social determinant of health. Next. Similarly, if you go to social epidemiology, which also tracks factors that influence social determinants that pattern health outcomes, again, articles about social contacts, about social capital, about race, ethnicity, but none broadly about stigma. Next. So in my view, this could be in part the fault of people like me who are stigma researchers. And one reason I think that is that we often study one condition at a time. So what you see in this slide is on the top are multiple things that can be influenced by stigma. Housing can be influenced, your income might be, your education, your social relationships, your self-esteem, or your health on the top there. On the left-hand side, we have a small list of conditions that might be stigmatized, so mental illness, sexual orientation, obesity, HIV, disability, and minority race ethnicity. So what we did in a paper advancing this idea was we looked at reviews, and what we found was that we would find that mental illness would be, stigma associated would be associated with something like social relationships. Now, if I had my PowerPoint, each one of these X's would pop up by itself, but let's look at that one, mental illness and social relationships. So I would do a study of mental illness stigma and whether it blocked people from having a robust set of social relationships. And all sorts of things influence social relationships. Stigma associated with mental illness might be one for people with mental illness, but there are all sorts of other ones, that their personalities, their family structure, all sorts of other things would also influence the social relationships. So what we might conclude is that mental illness stigma influences social relationships, but it's only one thing amongst many, and it might even be, the fifth, sixth most important one of all the other ones that exist for social relationships. And so we might conclude to ourselves, well, stigma is important, but not that important. Other things are important. And the idea of these other X's is if you go to the other ones, you do the same thing. Obesity and self-esteem. All sorts of things influence your self-esteem. Maybe obesity might be one aspect that could, obesity stigma could be one aspect that could also contribute. So the idea is, study after study, we're reporting to the research world that stigma matters, but it's only in the context of many other things. Now, the problem I have with that is that it doesn't consider stigma's effects on all. What about mental illness, stigma's effects on all the other domains? So if you add them up across the other domains, they might add up to be more. And then if you thought about stigma more broadly, so go to the next slide, please. Whoops, can we go back one? Oh, we went to the end somehow. Is it possible to go back?
Trying to figure that one out. Hold on. My arrows are not working in the back direction.
Oh.
Let me just try one more time. We may not be able to go back. Hold on.
There you go.
This one? Okay, perfect.
The next one, you had it just a second ago. Up.
One more?
That one.
Oh, there it is. Okay.
Yeah. Thanks. Should I keep going, or are you going to make it full screen?
Keep going. I will not.
Okay, I'll keep going.
How to make it full screen.
Okay. So the point I'm making there is, if you take the effect of multiple stigmas and on multiple outcomes and multiple social determinants of health, the effect is really large. It's like big. It's across all these conditions and across all these outcomes that have relevance for your health. The overall effect of stigma on health outcomes is likely large and deserves to be a social determinant in its own right. Okay, next one. So now I thought I'd just shift a little bit and come back to mental illness. I know that's the theme of this set of webinars. I tried to use examples throughout that were about mental illness, but also broaden it out so that we see that stigma is important also as a cause of mental health problems, But now I wanted to come back and talk just a little bit about some ideas for addressing mental illness stigma. And you've probably heard different ones from different people, and these are just ones that are prominent on my mind that I'll convey to you. So I'll talk a tiny bit about contact and a social movement to try to advance contact as a mechanism. So I'll talk just a little bit about interventions to address self-stigma. And then I want to talk a little bit about resisting the recreation of stereotypes that I think we all too frequently participate in ourselves without really knowing it. And finally, I want to tell you a little bit about a stigma intervention as part of public education in schools. So is it possible to learn about mental illness as part of becoming a citizen? So next one, please. So here you see one of my favorite people, Patrick Corrigan, who's kind of like Mr. Mental Illness Stigma. And he's done a lot of thinking about how to address stigma and made huge contributions. One of the things he's noticed is over and over again is the contact with a person who identifies as having a mental illness reduces mental health stigma in other people. And he's thought about this a long time. He's had experiences with mental illness himself, and he is thinking about how can we harness this great possibility of reducing stigma. And one of his ideas, and he knows it's not simple, is his idea of a social movement that says we're going to come out proud to erase the stigma of mental illness. And he has a book with stories and essays of solidarity along those lines. So that's one thing that I think could be powerful. I mean, we know, and he knows, that it's complicated because you can face, if you come out, you can face discrimination of some kind. But he's working on this supported way of coming out proud, as he puts it. So that's one thing I think is real important. Next one. The other one that's going on, and this, I need to keep up more with this, but I wanted to make sure I mentioned it to this group, and that is that there's interventions have been developed to try to address self-stigma, that is the internalization of what society confers. And this is, I think there's advances being made in this domain. I tried to do this on one of my studies, and I'm one of the failures in this. And I think people who are better at doing this kind of thing have taken it up and are now pushing it forward. But this is a summary of some of the early efforts to try to address self-stigma. There reports about 14 studies. 8 of them showed post-intervention reductions. Can we go back or no? Anyway, we can. Don't worry. I can just report what that slide said. Basically, that there were modest effect sizes. It didn't tend to work extremely well for people with really serious mental illness. Only 2 of 7 studies showed positive effects. But I think that area is developing and could be really useful so that we can help people move away from the internalization process in stigma. And here's one of my pet peeves, and I haven't developed this enough, but I want to. And that is, one of the assignments I give my students in my classes is a diary, to do a diary for a week and listen for mental illness words and how people use them. Now, usually they're not talking about people with mental illness. That's one thing I have people categorize, but how common words are about mental illness connected to mental illness, like crazy, insane, lunatic, and so on, that are used repeatedly in our daily conversations. And they link to dangerousness, undesirability, incompetence, irrationality, and being just generally bad. Now, this slips right by, but if you look at the op-eds in your newspapers, and we see a side that really wants to put down the other side in a political debate, they say they're lunatics, they're crazy, they're out of their minds. So that the Republicans talking about the Democrats, or the Democrats talking about the Republicans. This kind of language get used to describe something that's not really about mental illness at all. It's a really fundamental political difference, but it's called it's used mental illness words. And so subtly every day, this connection between mental illness words and bad things is repeated day in and day out. It's kind of a socialization process that we're all exposed to, but unless you do it for a week or so, you likely don't notice it. You just read through the paper, you get the idea that the Republicans don't like the Democrats don't like the Republicans. We don't think about the words that are used to convey that, and that people that you think are vicious and mean are called mental illness words. So that connection. And this sometimes stigma is portrayed as a residue of ignorance. We just have to teach people. But I think we're really, on an ongoing basis, socializing ourselves into this negative view in the background. Okay, next. Now, finally, and then we can talk a little bit, I think there's some great possibility to do interventions to educate youth about mental illnesses and about stigma. And this is an example we're just now writing up of an intervention that we conducted with 6th graders. The aims were to improve their knowledge and attitudes, to reduce their desire for staying away from other youth that had mental health problems, and also to encourage help seeking in the youth who experienced mental health problems, who had anxiety and depression and the like. And our idea was that schools are primary socialization mechanisms in our society, and there are schools all over our country, all over the world, really. And if you can develop an intervention that works in schools, you could disseminate it widely. It can be disseminated in Manhattan. It could be disseminated in northern Alaska. Okay, next. Oops. Okay, going back's too hard, huh? No, that's going.
No, I can get back to it.
There we go. So this is the design we implemented. It was a. It went to the next slide.
I didn't even touch it that time.
I don't know how it happened. Maybe I can describe it without you seeing the slide. It was a study done in 14 schools in Texas, and classrooms in different schools. So there was only one classroom in every school, and there was randomly assigned by classroom to either an intervention, calling opening minds, opening doors that you see on the slide there, or to contact, or to no intervention, basically. And then it was, we gave the intervention, we did a post-test, and then we followed the students who had the intervention for 2 full years to see whether or not those who were in the intervention changed their attitudes, had more knowledge, and were more likely to seek help for mental health problems if they had them. It was over 400 youth. It was an NIMH, National Institute of Mental Health, funded study. I think I got most elements of that. And then this was the intervention that we were really wanting to test. We put in the contact exposure as an alternative intervention because we wanted to test it, this one that you see, against contact, which was one that was known to be effective or had strong evidence for being effective. Okay, next one. By the way, this was developed by somebody other than me. I was the PI on the grant, but I had learned from my earlier studies that, that wasn't my special skill. So this time I got somebody who knew how to develop an intervention to partner with me. And then I sort of did the evaluation. But it was tried to engage the students. It started like a funnel. It started broad with just general kinds of differences. People are different in all sorts of ways. And you might even be different in some of these ways. And then to think about mental illness as just one other difference and have the youth think in those terms. And they tried to induce empathy for people who are different generally, but also particularly people with mental illness. It had some content about specific mental disorders, told people about them. Tried to engage the teachers. There's a guide that they could take up online. They had classroom activities. There were homework assignments so that the students were getting involved in it. And there was a video explanation to teachers about how to do this. So, and we tried to make it easy to disseminate in case it in fact worked. Next. And briefly, what we found is this curriculum intervention. And we think this could generalize. We don't think there's anything really special about our intervention. We think other ones could have similar effects. Can have positive effects on the social climate, that is, how much kids know about their attitudes about mental illness, and whether or not they want to stay away from other kids who have mental illnesses. So the climate, we saw positive effects on all three of those outcomes. And then on help-seeking behaviors. So our results indicate that these effects are not just short-term, but they appeared to endure for at least 2 years. And these effects on help-seeking are evident among those youth with the greatest need. So this study, I'm both in public health and in sociology, and public health tends to be optimistic and goes out and tries to change things. Sociology kind of looks at, how things are recreated and reproduced and all that. This gave me some hope that this actually seemed to have some positive effects that lasted for as long as 2 years, and could be disseminated more broadly, and could be introduced to people before their attitudes are totally fixed, when they're in 6th grade. And so I'll end on that sort of hopeful point. And I've left about almost 10 minutes for any questions in case anybody has any. Thank you very much for listening to me. I'm so glad you're doing all this. Oh, I had one more, but I think I probably addressed those. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Link, and thank you everyone for joining us. If anyone does have any questions, please put them in the chat box and we will get to those. And then I will go through a few of our closing notes as people are putting in questions. And we do want to mention that there are resources available at UC. If you have any questions about your individual behavioral health benefits, please go to UCNet and search using the keywords behavioral health. And another resource available to UC faculty and staff are the employee assistance and faculty staff assistance programs. Most UC locations have on-site offices with counselors you can talk to face-to-face. A list of those resources are also on UCNet, and you can find them using the keyword EAP. And again, recording link of this webinar will be available by the end of the week on the UCNet Stigma-Free UC page. And look for an upcoming announcement for our next webinar, which will be on July 17th with Dr. Ann Cheney from UC Riverside. So at that time, we'll hang around for a couple of minutes to see if there are any questions that come through. But otherwise, we thank you for joining and your interest in the topic and your willingness to learn. And thank you, Dr. Link.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so we did have a question come through, and it says, do you think using labels like crazy and insane to refer to a day, something, using labels like crazy? Okay, I'm going to work through this one, but I think it's, do you think using labels like crazy and insane to refer to a day is something that promotes use towards people?
So let me just see if I can, I like that question a lot. So what's being asked, I think, is sometimes we use the word crazy and it almost could sound positive about some things. Like at the basketball, he made this crazy shot at the end of the game and it went in. So one of the things I have my students do when we do these, when they listen for words, is evaluate whether or not it's negative or not. Generally, what they find is it is negative. And something like we just brought up there, it depends sort of on I think it could convey an out of the usual, even if it's referring to a day. It was a crazy day. It was so difficult. It was a crazy day. And it was irrational. So I think that though it does carry that notion that it was something unexpected, irrational kind of. And so I would say, I mean, I'm not perfect about this by any means, but I would like to try to find other words for that. It wouldn't hurt me. Keep my mind on stigma things, and but I think it's more important around things like when we call, terrorism, really horrible things with mental illness words. So that, that's a little milder what you brought up, but I think a lot of times it's about things that aren't so mild. And I think even around some of the mild things, it's conveying something that if it gets attached to mental illness and you assume that everyone with mental illness is like that, that's part of the stereotyping.
Thank you. And we do have another question, and it says, you mentioned that interventions addressing self-stigma showed some promising results. What were some of the interventions that were successful?
Yeah, so there's a variety that are out there. And some of the ones that have been used are cognitive behaviorally derived. So they use that approach from psychology to reframe and reorient people especially targeted towards addressing the stigma. And another approach that's gotten some play is called a narrative approach, and there have been some that have compared those two. The narrative approach is kind of like I probably won't do a good job of characterizing it, but it's kind of telling a story about your experience, and then help making it fit in your life and be more less harmful, more congenial, something like that. I probably didn't do a good job of that, but there are people who could tell you just about that. So those general themes have been things that people are trying to work out. They don't always work, so but I think they're making progress.
All right, and that is the end of the questions at this time. So again, we'll have the webinar going for another minute or two if anything else comes through, but otherwise. Okay, so thank you so much, Dr. Link, for joining us today.
Thanks.
I really appreciate you taking the time and helping keep Stigma-Free UC going throughout this year.
Okay, thanks a lot.
All right, thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.